difficult to talk of racial and gender differences that stem from discriminatory treatment. The assumption is that the U.S. matrix of domination now provides equal treatment because where it once overtly discriminated by race and gender, it now seemingly ignores them. Beliefs such as these thus allow whites and men to support a host of punitive policies that reinscribe social hierarchies of race and gender. In her discussion of how racism now relies on encoded language, Angela Davis identifies how this rhetoric of colorblindness can operate as a form of, quote, camouflaged racism, end quote. Because race, and this is her quote, because race is ostracized from some of the most impassioned political debates of this period, their racialized character becomes increasingly difficult to identify, especially by those who are unable or do not want to decipher the encoded language. This means that hidden racist arguments can be mobilized readily across racial boundaries and political alignments. Political positions once easily defined as conservative, liberal, and sometimes even radical, therefore have a tendency to lose their distinctiveness in the face of the seductions of this camouflaged racism. And there's the citation. Americans can talk of quote unquote street crime and quote unquote welfare mothers, all the while claiming that they are not discussing race at all. Despite the new challenges raised by the rhetoric of colorblindness and gender neutrality, it is important to remember that legal strategies have yielded and most probably will continue to produce victories for African American women. Historically, much of Black women's resistance to the policies and procedures of the structural domain of power occurred outside powerful social institutions. Currently, however, African American women are more often included in these same social institutions that long excluded us. Increasing numbers of African American women have gained access to higher education, now hold good jobs, and might be considered middle class if not elite. These women often occupy positions of authority inside schools, corporations, and government agencies. Achieving these results required changing U.S. laws. Who can I pass to?
Joan, I'll come back to you because you had the, you have your glasses now?
Yes, sure. Yes, I have I think they're the same ones that she has. It's so funny.
Do you know where we are, sweetie?
I think so. It's on the one hand, this new, on the one hand, this new inclusion provides new opportunities to work for equitable policies and procedures. Many of the women described in this volume who advance Black feminist thought do so from jobs held as bankers, college professors, corporate executives, news producers, teachers, social workers, physicians, and managers. Unlike Black women from prior eras who were confined to either agricultural or domestic work, these women hold positions of authority within major social institutions. On the other hand, this same inclusion raises new questions, primarily because the organizations they struggled so long to enter can look entirely different once they get inside. The disciplinary domain of power. Ordering schools, industries, hospitals, banks, and realtors to stop discriminating against Black women does not mean that these and other social institutions will comply. Laws may change, but the organizations that they regulate rarely change as rapidly. In the post-World War II period, African American women have gotten good jobs and achieved other positions of authority in organizations that formerly excluded them outright. As these women gained new angles of vision on the many ways that organizations discriminate, organizations searched for new ways to suppress Black women. If you can no longer keep Black women outside, then how can they best be regulated once they are inside? As a way of ruling that relies on bureaucratic hierarchies and techniques of surveillance, the disciplinary domain manages power relations. It does so not through social policies that are explicitly racist or sexist, but through the ways in which organizations are run. The disciplinary domain of power has increased in importance with the growing significance of bureaucracy as a mode of modern social organization. Bureaucracy, in turn, has become important in controlling populations, especially across race, gender, and other markers of difference. As an increasingly prevalent feature of modern transnational social organization, capitalist and socialist countries alike depend on bureaucracies. This style of organization becomes highly efficient in both reproducing intersecting oppressions and in masking their effects. Bureaucracies, regardless of the policies they promote, remain dedicated to disciplining and controlling their workforces and clientele. Whether the inner city public schools that many Black girls attend, the low-paid jobs in the rapidly growing service sector that young Black women are increasingly forced to take, and culture of the social welfare bureaucracy that Black mothers and children wait for hours, or the quote, mammified, unquote, work assigned to Black women professionals, the goal is the same: creating quiet, orderly, docile, and disciplined populations of Black women. In this bureaucratic context, surveillance has emerged as an important feature of the disciplinary domain of power. There is a marked difference between merely looking at Black women and keeping them under surveillance. Whether merely looking at Black women and keeping them under surveillance, oh, I said that, sorry. Whether the treatment of Black women on the auction block, the voyeuristic treatment of Sarah Bartman, or the portrayal of Black women within the contemporary pornography, objectifying Black women's bodies, has meant that members from more powerful groups have all felt entitled to watch Black women. Surveillance now constitutes a major mechanism of bureaucratic control. For example, within prisons, guards watch Black female inmates. Within businesses, middle managers supervise Black women clerical staff. And within universities, professors train their Black female graduate students within academic, quote, disciplines, unquote. The fact that prison guards, middle managers, and professors might themselves be Black women remains less important than the purpose of this surveillance. Ironically, Black women prison guards, middle managers, and professors may themselves be watched by wardens, business executives, and university deans. In these settings, discipline is ensured by keeping Black women as a mutually policing subordinate population under surveillance. When it comes to the disciplinary domain of power, resistance from inside bureaucracies constitutes the overarching strategy. Ironically, just as organizations may keep Black women under surveillance, these same Black women have the capacity to keep organizations themselves under surveillance. On the one hand, Black women's success in gaining positions of authority has produced new opportunity to use bureaucratic resources towards humanistic ends. This insider resistance tries to use bureaucratic resources towards, oh, I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words tonight. This insider resistance tries to capture positions of authority within social institutions in order to ensure that existing rules will be fairly administered and, if need be, to change the existing policies. Once inside, many Black women realize that more than getting hired is required to bring about change. Black women find themselves searching for innovative ways to foster bureaucratic change. An African-American colleague of mine once referred to this process as one of viewing her university as an egg and her job as one of, quote, working the cracks, unquote, from a distance, each egg appears to be smooth and seamless, but upon closer inspection, each egg's distinctive patterns of almost invisible cracks become visible. Her insider administrative position granted her a view of higher education, not as a well-oiled bureaucracy that was impervious to change, but as a series of cracks and fissures that represented organizational weaknesses. As she described it, she was committed to working the cracks and changing her workplace by persistent use of her insider knowledge concerning its pressure points. Once inside, many Black women do make a difference in how bureaucracies operate. Without much fanfare, they push for policy changes that move their organizations closer to basic fairness. Rarely mentioning words such as, quote, racism and sexism and discrimination, unquote, and the like, they find innovative ways to work the system so that it will become more fair. Can I pass it along?
Yeah. Maria, do you want to pick up here? We're on page 282.
282?
Yep.
Yes.
Hold on, let me get there.
Just wanted to say that Maya and I did have a hard time reading this chapter. It is like a pretty intellectual read, super important, and I'm glad we're doing it together. You know, to try to like break through it together. But it, you know,
If it's hard to read out loud, you're not alone.
yeah, you're definitely not alone.
It's a
Okay,
very,
so we're on the other hand, the second paragraph on 280.
well, wait a minute. Okay, wait, sorry. Hold on. There are 282s by the page. Oh, second paragraph, okay. Yeah, this is a very academic reading.
Yes,
which
that's
makes
the way to put it, an academic reading. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah, very academic. It would have been helpful to have some practical examples along the way, but maybe in our discussion we can bring those out.
Yeah.
So here we go. On the other hand, capturing positions of authority can foster new and unanticipated forms of disciplinary control. With dismay, many Black women in the United States come to recognize that whether intentional or not, different sets of rules may be applied to them that distinguish them from their counterparts. Whereas their diplomas and prior training may qualify them on paper, they may be treated as second-class citizens. US Black women's reactions to these new forms of disciplinary control typically reflect comparable heterogeneity. In this sense, the experiences of former generations of Black women, domestic workers, provide a template for analyzing the reactions of Black women who now desegregate a variety of bureaucracies. The existence of a collective wisdom available to domestic workers did not negate the heterogeneous responses they had to their jobs. Within the group, many individual responses emerged, most shaped by the actual working conditions that individual women encountered. The relations within bureaucracies are much the same. How African American women choose to deal with the changing forms of disciplinary power seems more the issue than the codification of this domain of power in large impersonal bureaucracies. US Black feminism in the academy offers a provocative case of these cross-cutting relationships. Unlike Black diasporic feminisms, where much of Black women's thought emerges in relation to women's activism, a good deal of US Black feminist thought must adhere to the disciplinary procedures of the academy. Elevating Black feminist thought to the level of theory and devaluing Black women's activism as less theoretical are strategies that aim to contain them both. Moreover, such actions place U.S. Black feminist thought in the academy under surveillance. Disciplinary pressures may explain, in part, the mismatch between issues that often interest U.S. Black women academics and those of pressing concern to large numbers of African American women. Ordinary, everyday women are often accused of either being afraid of feminism or being so downtrodden by daily obligations and the whims of their men that they cannot think about their own subordination. But another interpretation points to the lack of attention given within academic Black feminism to issues that affect African American women's lives. Many African American women may reject Black feminism because they cannot see clear connections between elite Black feminism's claims to be a progressive discourse and the actual conditions in their lives. For example, the entrenched patterns of poverty and its accompanying violence that affects so many African American women's lives suggests that gendered analysis of Black political economy become more prominent in US Black feminist thought. Such analyses should have implications for public policy, as well as what types of actions for community development are required to position US Blacks to address poverty. Despite the presence of such themes in the scholarship of some US Black feminists, these thinkers typically remain unrecognized within the academy as symbolic of Black feminism. For example, the 30-year span of Angela Davis's intellectual work clearly demonstrates her leadership in shaping US Black feminist thought. Yet Davis is less often described as a Black feminist than as a socialist. Davis may be deeply committed to Black feminist politics, but she may not be the kind of Black feminist that US higher education wants. Interesting. Given the power of surveillance in the disciplinary domain, it is unrealistic to expect that any essentially radical Black feminist thought will emanate from within the academy, especially in times when marketplace ideologies have become so prominent. Black feminist academics who wrap themselves in the flag of radicalism, feminist or otherwise, and use their self-proclaimed radical identity to push for promotion to full professor are simply deluding themselves. Marketplace ideologies increasingly affect all aspects of life, including actual people and ideas about people and outsider within locations. The number of US Black women employed by the academy, whether they recognize their outsider within locations or not, expand and shrink, not just in relation to political advocacy by African American women and other similarly disadvantaged groups, but in response to perceived marketplace needs. If an organization perceives that it needs outsiders within, it buys them. In this context, Black feminist thought in the academy is likely to become less focused on its own activist agenda and more on surviving and perhaps transcending academic politics. Thus, it is much more reasonable to investigate the ways in which Black feminist thought uses its placement in the academy to foster social justice and the ways in which its use and placement reinscribes existing social hierarchies. New section, the hegemonic domain of power. Tactics within the disciplinary domain of power can only be so effective. US Black women's success in gaining and exercising citizenship rights means that new ways must be found to involve African American women in supporting the very system that fosters their own subordination and that of many other groups. Because the hegemonic domain of power deals with ideology, culture, and consciousness, it becomes important in addressing this need. The structural and disciplinary domains of power operate through system-wide social policies managed primarily by bureaucracies. In contrast, the hegemonic domain of power aims to justify practices in these domains of power. By manipulating ideology and culture, the hegemonic domain acts as a link between social institutions, or structural domain, their organizational practices, close parentheses, disciplinary domain, and the level of everyday social interaction, interpersonal domain, close parentheses. To maintain their power, dominant groups create and maintain a popular system of common sense ideas that support their right to rule. In the United States, hegemonic ideologies concerning race, class, gender, sexuality, and nation are often so pervasive that it is difficult to conceptualize alternatives to them, let alone ways of resisting the social practices that they justify. For example, despite scant empirical research, beliefs about Black women's sexuality remain deeply held and widespread. Moreover, the sexual politics of Black womanhood reveals how important the controlling images applied to Black women's sexuality have been to the effective operation of domination overall. School curricula, religious teachings, community cultures, and family histories have long been important social locations for manufacturing ideologies needed to maintain oppression. However, an increasingly important dimension of why hegemonic ideologies concerning race, class, gender, sexuality, and nation remain so deeply entrenched lies, in part, in the growing sophistication of mass media in regulating intersecting oppressions. It is one thing to encounter school curricula that routinely exclude Black women as bona fide subjects of study, religious teachings that preach equality yet are often used to justify Black women's submission to all men, Black community ideologies that counsel Black women to be more feminine so that Black men can reclaim their masculinity, and family histories that cover up patterns of physical and emotional abuse that blame Black women for their own victimization. It is quite another to see images of US Black women as hoochies broadcast globally in seemingly infinite variation. In the United States, one would think that the combination of better educated public and scholarship designed to shatter old myths would effectively challenge hegemonic ideology. As the resurgence of white supremacist organizations with staunch beliefs about Black intellectual and moral inferiority suggests, this has not been the case. Instead, old ideas become recycled in new forms. Yesterday's welfare mother splits into social class specific images of the welfare queen and Black lady. Yesterday's Jezebel becomes today's racist and sexist ideologies, if they are disbelieved, lose their impact. Thus, an important feature of the hegemonic domain of power lies in the need to continually refashion images in order to solicit support for domination. Not just elite group support, but the endorsement of subordinated groups is needed for hegemonic ideologies to function smoothly. Realizing that Black feminist demands for social justice threaten existing power hierarchies, organizations must find ways of appearing to include African American women, reversing historical patterns of social exclusion associated with institutional discrimination while disempowering us. Ideas become critical within this effort to absorb and weaken Black women's resistance. Regardless of their placement in social hierarchies, other groups also encounter these pressures. For example, white women are told that they become race traitors if they date Black men, a stigma that is in effect asks them to calculate whether the gain of an interracial relationship is worth the loss of white privilege. Similarly, in the current reorganization of US racial ideologies, where Vietnamese, Cambodians, and other recent Asian immigrant groups jockey to find racial identity between the fixed points of Blackness and whiteness, Asians are encouraged to derogate Blacks. Taking one's place at the top of the minority ladder certainly provides better treatment than that dished out to Blacks and Native Americans who are relegated to the bottom. Yet, until the category of whiteness is expanded to reclassify Asians as white, becoming a model minority remains a hollow victory. The significance of the hegemonic domain of power lies in its ability to shape consciousness via the manipulation of ideas, images, symbols, and ideologies. As Black women's struggles for self-definition suggest, in contexts such as these where ideas matter, reclaiming the power of a free mind constitutes an important area of resistance. Reversing this process, whereby intersecting oppressions harness various dimensions of individual subjectivity for their own ends, becomes a central purpose of resistance. Thus, the hegemonic domain becomes a critical site for not just fending off hegemonic ideas from dominant culture, but in crafting counter-hegemonic knowledge that fosters changed consciousness. Regardless of the actual social locations where this process occurs, families, community settings, schools, religious institutions, or mass media institutions, the power of reclaiming these spaces for thinking and doing not what is expected of us constitutes an important dimension of Black women's empowerment. By emphasizing the power of self-definition and the necessity of a free mind, Black feminist thought speaks to the importance that African American women thinkers place on consciousness as a sphere of freedom. Rather than viewing consciousness as a fixed entity, a more useful approach sees it as continually evolving and negotiated. A dynamic consciousness is vital to both individual and group agency. Based on their personal histories, individuals experience and resist domination differently. Each individual has a unique and continually evolving personal biography made up of concrete experiences, values, motivations, and emotions. No two individuals occupy the same social space. Thus, no two biographies are identical. Human ties can be freeing and empowering, as is the case with many Black women's heterosexual love relationships, or in the power of motherhood in African American families and communities. Human ties can also be confining and oppressive, as in cases of domestic violence or struggles to sustain mother-child families in inner city neighborhoods. The same situation can look quite different depending on the consciousness one brings to interpret it. The cultural context formed by these experiences and ideas that are shared with other members of a group or community give meaning to individual biographies. Each individual biography is rooted in several overlapping cultural contexts. Hold on.
You ready to pass it off, Maria?
I'm sorry, I lost I pressed a button and I lost where I was.
Oh, that's okay.
Is it 286?
Yep. Also, we can, if you feel like handing it off, we can take over here.
Okay, thank you then. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Each individual biography is rooted in several overlapping cultural contexts. For example, groups defined by race, social class, age, gender, religion, and sexual orientation. The most cohesive cultural contexts are those with identifiable histories, geographic locations, and social institutions. Some can be so tightly interwoven that they appear to be one cultural context, the situation of traditional societies with customs that are carried on across generations, or that of protracted racial segregation in the US, where Blacks saw a unity of interests that necessarily suppressed internal differences within the category, quote, Black. Moreover, cultural contexts contribute, among other things, the concepts used in thinking and acting. Subjugated knowledges, such as Black women's thought, develop in cultural contexts controlled by oppressed groups. Dominant groups aim to replace subjugated knowledge with their own specialized thought because they realize that gaining control over this dimension of subordinate groups' lives simplifies control. While efforts to influence this dimension of an oppressed group's experiences can be partially successful, this level is more difficult to control than dominant groups would have us believe. For example, adhering to externally derived standards of beauty leads many African American women to dislike their skin color or hair texture. Similarly, internalizing prevailing gender ideology leads some Black men to abuse Black women. These are cases of the successful infusion of dominant ideologies into the everyday cultural context of African Americans. But the long-standing existence of Black women's resistance traditions as expressed through Black women's relationships with one another, the Black women's blues tradition, and the voices of contemporary African American women writers all attest to the difficulty of eliminating the cultural context as a fundamental site of resistance. In their efforts to re-articulate the standpoint of African American women as a group, Black feminist thinkers potentially offer individual African American women the conceptual tools to resist oppression. Empowerment in this context is twofold. Gaining the critical consciousness to unpack hegemonic ideologies is empowering. Coming to recognize that one need not believe everything one is told and taught is freeing for many Black women. But while criticizing hegemonic ideologies remains necessary, such critiques are basically reactive. Thus, the second dimension of empowerment within the hegemonic domain of power consists of constructing new knowledge. In this regard, the core themes, interpretive frameworks, and epistemological approaches of Black feminist thought can be highly empowering because they provide alternatives to the ways things are supposed to be. Interpersonal domain of power. African American women have been victimized by intersecting oppressions, but portraying US Black women solely as passive, unfortunate recipients of abuse stifles notions that Black women can actively work to change our circumstances and bring about changes in our lives. Similarly, presenting African American women solely as heroic figures who easily engage in resisting oppression on all fronts minimizes the very real costs of oppression and can foster the perception that Black women need no help because we can, quote, take it. Domination operates by seducing, pressuring, or forcing African American women, members of subordinated groups, and all individuals to replace individual and cultural ways of knowing with the dominant group's specialized thought. Hegemonic ideologies that, in turn, justify practices of other domains of power. As a result, suggests Audre Lorde, quote, the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations which we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us. 1984. Or as Toni Cade Bambara succinctly states, quote, revolution begins with the self, in the self, 1970. Lorde and Bambara's suppositions raise an important issue for Black women and for all others working for social change. Although most individuals have little difficulty identifying their own victimization within some major system of oppression, whether it be by race, social class, religion, physical ability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, age, or gender, they typically fail to see how their thoughts and actions uphold someone else's subordination. Thus, white feminists routinely point with confidence to their oppression as women, but resist seeing how much their white skin privileges them. African Americans who possess eloquent analysis of racism often persist in viewing poor white men as symbols of white power. The radical left fares little better. Quote, if only people of color and women could see their true class interests, they argue, class solidarity would eliminate racism and sexism, end quote. In essence, each group identifies the oppression with which it feels most comfortable as being fundamental and classifies all others as being of lesser importance. Oppression is filled with such contradictions because these approaches fail to recognize that a matrix of domination contains few pure victims or pure oppressors. Each individual derives varying amounts of penalty and privilege from the multiple systems of oppression which frame everyone's lives. Individual biographies are situated within all domains of power and reflect their interconnections and contradictions. Whereas the structural domain of power organizes the macro level of social organization, with the disciplinary domain managing its operations, the interpersonal domain functions through routinized day-to-day practices of how people treat one another, e.g., micro level of social organization. Such practices are systematic, recurrent, and so familiar that they often go unnoticed, because the interpersonal domain stresses the everyday. Resistance strategies within this domain can take as many forms as there are individuals. When I ask my students for examples of how they respond to everyday racism, sexism, or other unfair treatment, the range of strategies they give surprises me. One Black woman student described how, when she is followed in a store, she fills her shopping cart to the brim with goods and then leaves it at the front, stopping by the service desk to complain about their surveillance policy. Two students, one African American and the other white, told of how they switched names on their respective papers when they suspected that the Black student's lower grades reflected the professor's prejudice. To their chagrin, when the switched papers were returned to them, the Black student got her same old C, whereas the white student received her A, even though they had submitted each other's work. Coalition strategies such as these become especially important in integrated social settings where different treatment is hard to detect. When you look for it, people who are actively engaged in changing the terms of their everyday relationships with one another surface in surprising places. Certainly, this book has shared many examples of prominent African American women who try to change the ways in which they live their everyday lives. What remains less visible, however, are the myriad ways in which ordinary individuals from all walks of life work for social justice in small, yet highly significant ways. One of my favorite examples concerns an invitation that my daughter received to visit a kindergarten playmate's house. Her classmate was a blue-eyed, blonde boy who was well-mannered and friendly to her and me. However, because I did not know his parents very well, I wondered what type of reception our daughter would have in his home. Ironically, my concerns were reduced when I saw the toy that his mother allowed him to bring to school. There was this little boy, blue eyes, blonde hair and all, carrying a black, bald, male Cabbage Patch doll to school. This was not his only toy, but the fact that this toy was included in the repertoire of this small child's imagination astounded me. With this one small act, this mother took a stand against racism, sexism, and heterosexism in a way that took courage for this region of the US. To this day, I do not know why she did it. Her intentionality was far less important than the unspoken actions that she took. I share this story not to encourage people to give dolls to little blonde boys, unless, of course, they really wish to do so, but rather to illustrate one of many unobtrusive yet creative ways that all sorts of ordinary people work to change the world around them. Shakura, do you feel like hopping on there? We are 288 at the new section, The Politics of Empowerment.
The Politics of Empowerment. Rethinking Black feminism as a social justice project involves developing a complex notion of empowerment, shifting the analysis to investigating how the matrix of domination is structured along certain axes, race, gender, class, sexuality, and nation, as well as how it operates through interconnected domains of power, structural, interpersonal, disciplinary, and hegemonic. reveals that the dialectical relationship, wow, this language, sorry, uh, reveals that the dialectical relationship linking oppression and activism is far more complex than simple models of oppressors and oppressed would suggest. This inclusive perspective enables African American women to avoid labeling one form of oppression as more important than others, or one expression of activism as more radical than another. It also creates conceptual space to identify some new linkages. Just as oppression is complex, so must resistance aimed at fostering empowerment demonstrate a similar complexity. When it comes to power, the challenges raised by the synergistic relationship among domains of power generate new opportunities and constraints for African American women who now desegregate schools and workplaces as well as those who do not. On the one hand, entering places that denied access to our mothers provides new opportunities for fostering social justice. Depending on the setting, using the insights gained via outsider within status can be a stimulus to creativity that helps both African American women and our new organizational homes. On the other hand, the commodification of outsider within status, whereby African American women's value to an organization lies solely in our ability to market a seemingly permanent marginal status, can suppress Black women's empowerment. Being a permanent outsider within can never lead to power because the category, by definition, requires marginality. Each individual must find her own way, recognizing that her personal biography, while unique, is never as unique as she thinks. When it comes to knowledge, Black women's empowerment involves rejecting the dimensions of knowledge that perpetuate objectification, commodification, and exploitation. African American women and others like us become empowered when we understand and use those dimensions of our individual group, and formal educational ways of knowing that foster our humanity. When Black women value our self-definitions, participate in Black women's domestic and transnational activist traditions, view the skills gained in schools as part of a focused education for Black community development, and invoke Black feminist epistemologies as central to our worldviews, we empower ourselves. C. Wright Mills' 1959 concept of quote unquote sociological imagination identifies its task and its promise as a way of knowing that enables individuals to grasp the relations between history and biography within society. Resembling the holistic epistemology required by Black feminism, using one's point of view to engage the sociological imagination can empower the individual. Quote, "My fullest concentration of energy is available to me," end quote, Audre Lorde maintains, end quote, "only when I integrate all the parts of who I am openly, allowing power from particular sources of my living to flow back and forth freely through all my different selves without the restriction of externally imposed definition," end quote, 1984. Developing a Black woman's standpoint to engage a collective Black feminist imagination can empower the group. Black women's empowerment involves revitalization U.S. Black feminism as a social justice project organized around the dual goals of empowering African American women and fostering social justice in a transnational context. Black feminist thoughts emphasis on the ongoing interplay between Black women's oppression and Black women's activism presents the matrix of domination and its interrelated domains of power as responsive to human agency. Such thought views the world as a dynamic place where the goal is not merely to survive or to fit in or to cope. Rather, it becomes a place where we feel ownership and accountability. The existence of Black feminist thought suggests that there is always choice and power to act, no matter how bleak the situation may appear to be. Viewing the world as one in the making raises the issue of individual responsibility for bringing about change. It also shows that while individual empowerment is key, only collective action can effectively generate the lasting institutional transformation required for social justice. In 1831, Maria Stuart asked, quote, "How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles," end quote. Richardson, 1987. Stewart's response speaks eloquently to the connections between knowledge, consciousness, and the politics of empowerment. And this is Stewart's quote: "Until union, knowledge, and love begin to flow among us, how long shall a mean set of men flatter us with their smiles and enrich themselves with our hard earnings? Their wise fingers sparkling with rings, and they themselves laughing at our folly. Until we begin to promote and patronize each other, do you ask, what can we do? Unite and build a store of your own? Do you ask, where is the money? We have spent more than enough for nonsense. Do what building we should want." Richardson, 1987. Is that it?
Yep, that's the
Great
end of the
job,
chapter.
Shakara.
Thank you so
Woo!
much.
Dang.
We
That
did
is-
it.
It is a tough read, but super, super important. Thank you all so much for your help tonight. We have 4 questions for our discussion section, but first, we always will ask if there's anyone tonight who wants to read our community guidelines out for us. I'm going to put them in the chat. Thank you. We're going to grab a computer charger. Okay, I've just uploaded the guidelines into the chat. If anyone feels like reading them out loud tonight, that would be amazing. And now would be the time to let us know. And if not, Olan, our fabulous metabolic team member Olan will read them. I've put that link in the chat for you.
So let me know if, and Dee says she can do too.
Sure, Dee, that would be great.
Okay, I'll start with the guidelines. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. We agree that a community member that is white or non-Black person of color will not use the N-word when referring to or when reading the N-word. The community member will say N-word. We agree to blame ourselves or others for misinformation we have learned, but accept responsibility of not repeating misinformation after we have learned otherwise. We agree to listen respectfully to each other without interruptions. Only one person speaks at a time. However, this does not mean we should ignore problematic statements. We are dedicated to creating a space for calling people in when possible instead of relying on calling people out. However, both approaches are valid and can be done with care and respect. With the goal of helping each other learn, we acknowledge that we may not be at different stages of learning on the content and discussion topics. We agree that no one should be required or expected to speak for their whole race or gender. We can't even if we wanted to. We will hold each other's best interests in heart. We hope everyone has come to the table to learn, grow, and share. We will trust that people are doing the best they can. Let's challenge and encourage each other to do better. Share responsibility for including all voices in discussion. If you have a tendency to dominate discussions, try taking a step back If you tend to stay quiet, try challenging yourself to share ideas so others can learn from you. Guideline number 7, silence is golden. Sometimes there will be long pauses. Sometimes silence can create space for folks who need that space to come forward. We agree to not fill silence out of discomfort. We hold this silence with care and move forward intentionally. We welcome those of you whose minds are bursting with ideas to write them in the chat bar. And I'll stop at number 7 if someone wants to pick up. Olan, number 8.
Okay, 8. The facilitators are not experts. They are here to help facilitate the process. They and everyone in the group are here to learn. We also recognize that everyone has an opinion. Opinions, however, are not the same as informed knowledge backed up by research. Depending on the topic and context, both are valid to share, but it's important to know the difference. To engage in deep learning, we will want to lean more toward informed knowledge and gain practice reflecting and speaking thoughtfully on difficult topics. Number 9, it's okay not to know. Keep in mind that we are all still learning and are bound to make mistakes when approaching a complex task or exploring new ideas. Be open to changing your mind and make space for others to do so as well. 10, the facilitators are not moderators. They are not trained to moderate personal grievances. If discussion stops being about the reading and instead breaches into accusations and aggression, please respect the facilitator switching gears and refocusing on the text. And here's a note. If any of these guidelines are breached, Metabolic team member Anissa will reach out to you privately in the chat to provide a reminder. If the guidelines can be breached, Anissa will provide a verbal call-in. By staying on this Zoom call, you are agreeing to these community guidelines for our discussion period.
Thank you, Dee and Olan, for reading
Thank
our
you.
guidelines. They're in the chat, and they're also as a Word document as well if you want to download them. And last thing that I forgot to mention on there is that just as a kind of housekeeping, we try to mute ourselves when we aren't talking because it feedback, like you can hear your voice in other people when they don't mute themselves. So that's just a general note, not necessarily a community guideline, but just a reminder. So our first question for tonight, this was obviously, we've said it many times, it's a difficult read. So, you know, there's a lot to discuss, but our first question is, on page 283, Collins discusses the ways that Angela Davis is labeled more frequently as a socialist than as a Black feminist, and how this exclusion might be because she's not the kind of Black feminist that U.S. higher education wants. What takeaways do you have from this distinction? What kind of feminist might U.S. higher education want? I'm putting that question in the chat, and I'm gonna mute myself.
Okay, I just wanted to say that, let me just get all your faces. Yeah, I think that's why she's not regarded as such. First of all, she's not light-skinned. She wears a huge afro. It's really the aesthetic of things. If they're going to accept a feminist, if people are going to accept a feminist, let them be more Barbie doll-like. Do you understand? They think that's, the people who make the rules think that's a more palatable way to go on. And also it's pretty audacious to judge who is not a feminist. And also to tack on the socialist, especially during that time, was also to deem her as a commie. So that to disqualify her intelligence, to disqualify her experience and everything else, and make her look like an enemy. So yeah, it was a lot of stuff working against her during that time, and it was really based on these very racist-ish reasons.
Like you saying, I what I thought when I heard that, because that really stuck to me when I heard it. That was one of the things that I started thinking about, and that's that the dual identity as a feminist and a socialist. It's not that they're competing with each other, but it's that it's a double barrel, because in an academic environment, perhaps they, if they're, evaluating Angela Davis for a position at a university, maybe they want to they want people to talk about economics and political theory in a different department than a feminist department. They don't, I'm wondering whether they want that much content in one person. And the truth is that she's a strong feminist and she's a strong socialist, and those are big guns. And so, she's a powerhouse. And we know that, the establishment bureaucracy doesn't like strong women, let alone strong Black women.
I wanted to add on to that and just say that, Angela Davis, she was known as like a terrorist in the 1960s and 70s.
That's right.
I have a quote. Richard Nixon, it doesn't say the year, but I'm guessing when he was president, congratulated the FBI on its, quote, capture of the dangerous terrorist Angela Davis. So even though she wasn't convicted of any of the crimes, she has that in her past, and higher up, the establishment doesn't want probably to acknowledge that that she was wrongly accused, and also she was held at, yeah.
She promoted using the courtroom as a stage, as a bully pulpit, which I think is brilliant.
She's too smart. The establishment doesn't want smart.
I wanted to ask again, when was this book published? Was it 2001?
Yeah, 2001.
Yeah, it had some pretty advanced ideas in there that became pretty much a rhetoric for today's society to deal with. But going back just a little bit to Angela Davis, during that time, since I was around that time, the atmosphere of fear that perpetuated that any forward-thinking Black person was a terrorist or a con artist or a gangster was so prevalent. There was just, no matter what words you spoke, you were always suspect. And I'm going to stop talking because I've done enough.
And this is a point to think about how each of us feels about the word anarchist or socialist. I don't think they're as scary, and I think that they're part of the abolitionist movement. So the idea that it has become a dangerous word that people want to avoid being associated with is important to think about.
All right, I'm going to ask the next question. Thank you all so much. And just a note, feel free to return to any of the questions that we asked. You don't have to answer them in succession. And if you have your own questions, or if you want to go on your own realm of things, feel free. They don't have to follow our questions that we're asking. So the next question is, on page 287, Collins quotes Audre Lorde, quote, "The true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations which we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within us." What reflections do y'all have from this quote? And what ways can you conceive of confronting the oppressor in each of ourselves?
One thing that struck me about the use of that verb implanted was that it just felt like a similar word that's used in discussing reproduction and fertility, and the idea of not letting this grow within ourselves or bringing it to light in the world, not to birth further reproductions of these harmful ideologies, but to do the work in our own generation within ourselves to prevent the spread and the continued longevity of these harmful systems and structures.
Thank you, Rowena. I saw B, you just asked for me to repeat the question. I put it in the chat, and I'll also read it out loud one more time, but for folks who are needing to look it over, it's there in the chat. On page 287, Collins quotes Audre Lorde, quote, the true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations which we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within us." What reflections do y'all have from this quote, and what ways can you conceive of confronting the oppressor in each of ourselves?
I think a very basic start is in trying to identify what part in ourselves is not ourselves, is the oppressor. And in order to begin to address escaping the oppressor. And that's a difficult first step for finding what is not the true you before you can begin to progress.
One of the paragraphs that I read, a few of the concepts had to do with the disciplinary control that happens in institutions is particularly for people of color and for Black African Americans. And it talked about how capturing a position of authority in that structure, like for instance, becoming going on staff or being hired to be a professor at a major university in any field, if you're African American, those people, those women, those men who are entering quote unquote a white social disciplinary culture or controlled culture, it talked about how the oppressed new authority figure finds, like unanticipated forms of control. And it went on to talk about how Black women in position that gain positions of power realize that, whether it's intentional or not, they have different sets of rules applied to them because of the color of their skin. And there are lessons then to be learned from Black women's domestic workers who have experienced that kind of control and disciplinary, reactivity, that, there's like kind of a template. They talked about a template for analyzing the reactions of Black women who are now in positions within bureaucracies. So it's kind of, it's not only being Black, but it's also moving into a new, economic status or position of control, that your Blackness is going to affect your position in your new, station in life or such. And so there's a struggle there. So there's that's kind of interesting, I thought.
I really need to say something here. I cannot tell you how many times in my lifetime, and I've been around for a long time, that in the corporate, even entertainment fields, anything, that if the powers that be want to thoroughly manipulate and undermine any person of color, especially a Black woman's position, they'll either one, hire another Black and have them duke it out, or basically eliminate the job. And what I mean to say that is, it's very rare, and it's still very rare in a corporate environment, and on the ones I've been into, and even in the entertainment world, if you have one Black person, and that's all they can take at this time. That's it. That's it. That's all they can take. And what happens is, when there is another Black person that gets into the same situation, we as Black women undermine ourselves with our oppressive thoughts and really end up sometimes psychologically attacking that person too, who's just in the same victimization as we are, because we've been so indoctrinated with this whole thing of you gotta compete. You gotta be the one that gets up to the top. Don't let anybody else do it. And it's a tragic thing that repeats itself over and over again, unfortunately.
In the entertainment industry, it seems similar in writers' rooms when they bring in a woman or a person of color. They don't really want to disrupt the culture of the room. They don't want to do it differently.
This is excellent in Slovenia. I spent 30 years in institutional organized religion. I've been told by mentors who would take me seriously when I wore makeup, that I should not present myself as angry.
Lexa, we're having a hard time hearing you, unfortunately.
Try that.
What'd you say?
Okay. Thanks.
I'm sorry. Would you mind typing it in the chat? Because I'd love to hear what you wanted to share. Well, this quote, the Audre Lorde quote, really struck a chord with me in large part because I think it's really interesting for us to deconstruct what it means to have a seed of the oppressor within ourselves and how we obviously absorb the cultures that we are both raised in and just around. And I was thinking about how education, you know, just educating ourselves and reading and discussing things actually does kind of tackle the seed of oppression within ourselves, because we are able to deconstruct that seed and understand where it comes from and why it's there. So I've just been thinking about that quote and this series that we have managed to do all together, and how I feel like in a lot of ways we are addressing the seeds within ourselves.
Just wanted to try and this quote for me, it made me think of things that I've learned growing up in Vermont, and really, I mean, in America, I guess you could say too. But sorry, that sounded weird. But anyways, just thinking about like the seed of the oppressor in myself, being a white cisgendered man, you know, that, and like understanding that there is also, I'm kind of historically known as the oppressor, you know, a white guy, and also just coming to realize that I also have seeds of the oppressor within myself. And like, just to give like a quick example of it, that, you know, that I'm constantly dealing with and trying to understand and remove. You know, last night I was reading Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, and there was a quick, brief quote of the Green Mountain Boys in Vermont talking about how Vermont is this vast wilderness and it's wild. And I was reading it to Maya, and she had the great point of, well, actually, what is wild, and the people that were in Vermont at that time, did they think it was wild? And so that's kind of this derogatory narrative of the people that lived here first, you know, and that was kind of like an example of like understand, you know, like how deep-seated this all is and how ingrained in our vocabulary it is, of how, you know, there is oppression, you know, oppression takes many different forms, and just trying to realize where it is. I hope that made sense.
It did. Thanks for saying that.
I really appreciated something you said, Shelley, about how there's this reluctance to change the culture even within a room or a single organization. And that idea, kind of going back to the first question, of what type of academic would an institution want to hire, and that being one that would be a subversive but be able to work within the existing culture, which does have hierarchies defining who is going to be the dominant power and who will be the tolerated forces of resistance. But by defining those institutions that recognize a culture that can be interpreted as, progressive or academic, will still be able to define and control those forces that are recognized as resistant. And to free ourselves from that, new cultures, I think, are needed, new models.
Yeah, the thread that runs through from trying to tell Angela Davis who she is to what Chikura was saying about controlling people in the room. That control is the thread that comes through, and it's, from what I've been hearing over this course, the abolitionist movement is really trying to shift the idea of somebody controlling somebody else and making it more about cooperation and understanding. I mean, just as simple as that seems to be at the heart of it. But the feeling of control being the driving force through all of this systemic racism just really bearing in on me tonight.
We're going to read the next question. This one. On page 288, Collins describes a little blue-eyed, blonde-haired white boy who had a black, bald, male Cabbage Patch doll. She states that, quote, with this one small act, this mother took a stand against racism, sexism, heterosexism in a way that took courage for this region of the U.S. End quote. What are some takeaways y'all have from this section? What is the stance this mother took? And what is the significance of this doll? I'm going to throw that in the chat.
I was listening to this passage because I had a discussion with my daughter regarding gender role and toys and culture. And it struck me that often making categories is what separates us. And breaking categories and stopping differentiating people on criteria that do not really apply on gender, etc.
I'm so sad to say you're breaking up really intensely.
Okay, all right. Okay.
Sorry. Now you're here. Now we can hear you.
Okay, I will type it. I will type it.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'd love
Please try to turn off your video. It might come through.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe try now and we'll see if it sounds.
Okay. So can you hear me better now?
Yeah, I'll let you know if it stops.
Okay. So I was talking with I had a discussion with my daughter just yesterday regarding gender roles, and she works with very young children, so she does see how children very young are affected by their parents talking to them about gender roles and etc. And I think that when you start categorizing people, gender, race, culture, and this is and when you start breaking down this system, and you start opening your mind, and you start realizing that the system of a category is really a way of separating people, and they are all social construct, whether it's gender or race, etc. So what you described with a little blonde, blue-eyed kid, I think this is something I see a lot in young parents now, and I'm very hopeful because I see a new generation not paying so much attention to categories and not being put in a box, and therefore being more attentive to other perceived groups and being more open. And maybe that could be a way to break down the oppressor within yourself. When you stop putting yourself in a box and putting other people in a box, then you are a lot freer to consider all others as peers. I don't know how much you were able to hear, but I hope so.
We heard all of that. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to read the last question in the interest of time. And please feel free to go back, as we said, to any of the questions that we've asked thus far. This is a quote, viewing the world as one in the making raises the issue of individual responsibility for bringing about change. It also shows that while individual empowerment is key, only collective action can effectively generate the lasting institutional transformation required for social justice. End quote, page 290. What are ways you can imagine collective action could generate institutional transformation?
I'll just simply say Black Lives Matter collectives, stuff like that.
Voting.
I was thinking about how important it is for us to get out of our comfort zones, which this group obviously is doing, instead of just asking people of color to come into our comfort zones. I think a big part of what is important is knowing people who are different from us, and then it's personal, and then you empathize. And I think the way we've handled integration has not worked for everyone involved, but I think it is that story about the doll. When my daughter was young, she wanted to have a softball party in the park, and she wanted a softball cake with softball figures on it and play softball. And she went to a school that was pretty diverse. And I went to go order the cake, and I said, because I thought of it, because we were in that situation, whether they had figures, baseball players of different colors for the cake. And they said, no, we don't. And when I showed up to pick up the cake, I thought, well, I'll be painting some of them. And they found figures. They went and got them. And I was going, that's such a tiny thing. Like the doll is really a small thing, and it's not difficult for us to add, but it makes a little bit of a change. Nick, was it you last week who asked the question about, I think it was basically about violent revolution?
Yes, I
I've
did.
been thinking about that. I just heard a great lecture with Mary Berry, Wendell Berry's daughter, and Bill McKibben, the environmentalist. And they made a distinction between what they do. And they were saying Bill is kind of like a firefighter. helping put out the fire, deal with emergency. And what Mary Berry is focusing on is what's next. And I think if there's any form of revolution, where revolutions historically have gone wrong, is so often they revert to something conservative again because people get scared, and it's very easy to take over from the top down and reassert power, some sort of fascist or other sort of government. So I think that idea of who's planning for what you want to have happen next is a question when you ask about revolution. Mm-hmm. You know, a certain number of people have to be focused on the future. That's what I was thinking about that.
I'm going to think about that too.
Let me know what you think.
I will. I guess I firstly just want to say I am within the chat. Please forgive me for my typo before, because it was really terrible. Rather than saying admiring, I said, or I'm sorry, rather than saying admitting, I said admiring. But I'm really still thinking about that Audre Lorde quote from the first, I think it was the first question, of thinking of the oppressor and how you fight that. I'm thinking about abolition, and I'm thinking about all of these interrelated things. And I think that holding the fossil fuel industry accountable for its violence done to communities is very important. And I feel the need to say that because I think that these are all bricks that make up a building, and that building is the institution. And yeah, without rambling, that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you for that, Nick. And I think it's important that, that we do acknowledge the fossil fuel industry in this discussion, because it is so interwoven in this dilemma of this capitalist system that we live within, and how that creates pretty horrifying situations for all of us. Thinking about the ways that collective action can create systemic change. I was in a surge showing up for racial justice, an organization that I work with occasionally, and that I really love and value and look up to. I was in a meeting last week that someone said something that really moved me, that made me reflect today on that quote, which is part of what Surge has been doing for the past 5 months, 6 months, is the Collect Your Cousins campaign, which is about calling white Democratic voters in Georgia and having discussions about systemic racism and about what tactics we can take to target that and really stand as a collective against systemic racism in the South, and also organize. The reason it's called Collect Your Cousins is that for generations, Black activists have been asking white people to organize around anti-racism. And the Collect Your Cousins campaign is about white folks collecting other white folks into the anti-racist discussion, specifically focusing on the South. And something that someone said in this last meeting, which was really empowering to me, was, can we change, because part of this campaign is about voting and educating folks about what's on the ballot. And their question was, can we change how Georgia ends up voting? Maybe, Will we change how Georgia votes? Who knows, but we're going to try. And I was like, yeah. So they've spent 6 months. We've every Thursday, and now it's Thursdays and Saturdays, phone banked with hundreds of, thousands of people in total to call Georgia voters every week and have discussions. And I'm like, yeah, that's so empowering to me that, like, can we do it? Maybe, but we're going to try, regardless. That's what's important, is that we're trying.
I agree so much. I think it's the will to try and the will to do action. It's all like, and it's amazing. This reading series has been really amazing because it's a process of learning, and that action is, I don't know, it's crucial. And the will to learn is really crucial. So thank you.
Maya and Ryan, I just want to thank you before I sign off for the evening for these amazing 12 weeks of reading and sharing and learning. And I just wanted to say that next Friday, we're going to keep this space open and lay out all of the embroideries that we've received, and offer up a time to reflect on the series, and just kind of have some space and time to talk about it. So thank you. And I was also really struck by the genesis of this project, Maya, in your sort of recognizing after the murder of George Floyd that it was important that we stopped and really reflect the oppressor within us. Just like Audre Lorde, you didn't use that language, but to really examine what we don't know and really search deep within ourselves for how to support and assist the abolitionist movement while being who we are with our own sense of history and oppression. So thank you, and thank you to everybody who's participated in these 12 amazing weeks. And please join us next week to unpack this event. But thank you very much again, Maya and Ryan.
Thank you, Mom. And
thanks, Lauren.
I also want to say that this has been so moving for me, and I know for Ryan.
Definitely.
To be able to have these discussions with all of you each week. And when I was putting this syllabus together, I thought it was really important that we end on this reading as a politics of empowerment, and recognizing, that this is about empowerment. This educating ourselves is about empowering ourselves, and Black feminism is about empowering everyone. And that's super important for us to end on. And I love that the last quote that we have is about interrogating the seeds of oppression within us. And that's such an important way to move forward in the world, because all of us have these seeds of oppression. So, thank you. Should we have an unmute and a collective good night all together before we sign off?
Yes.
Yay.
Yes.
What a family. I'm going to miss you, family.
I'm going to miss you guys.
I'm going to miss you, family. Sorry.
That was super fun in some ways.
This has been great. Thank you, everybody.
All of your work in organizing this, and everyone for your very insightful
sincere contributions.
I don't want to leave.
I never do.
Yeah, many thanks, Maya, Ryan, and everyone at Metabolic for holding this series. It's really important, and thank you all.
Let us know what's next.
Well,
Yeah.
we're in discussion. If you have any ideas.
And I just want to say, since you mentioned Surge, on Wednesdays they have an Abolition Action Zap at 11 a.m. You have to sign up. It is amazing. For an hour, you see up, a couple hundred people making phone calls, sending emails. So much gets done in such a short period of time. It's energizing.
Thank you, Shelley. And I'll also keep the daily actions that I've been putting together each morning. If you want to check those out, it has a schedule each day of events you can participate online to engage in anti-racist work and abolitionist work. And I'll put that link in the chat.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Abolition Action Zaps are on there. There you go.
Thank you all. Good night from
See
Brooklyn.
you next week in a new
Bye,
configuration.
Maya, Ryan. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Seeing everyone.
Thank you, Maya and Ryan. Great job.
Thanks, Michelle.
Have a good night.
Thanks,
Thank
Jen.
you all. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Stay safe.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Norris family.
See you later.
Bye,
Bye,
everyone.
Nia.
Maria.
Bye, Vicky.
Bye, Vicky.
Great job, you guys. It's incredible.
Thanks, Emily.
We did it! We did
Yeah,
it!
congratulations. You should get a trophy or like some kind of crazy medal. Thanks, everybody.
Crazy metal.
You know, be pretty sweet.
We'll see y'all later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.